Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Halifax International Security Forum in Nova Scotia, Canada, one of the world's truly great security conferences. Our coverage here is sponsored by Boeing and Leonardo DRS, and it's our honor to be talking to Baroness Neville-Jones, a member of the House of Lords with an extraordinary diplomatic career that spans back, I think, if I recall correctly, 1963, and then a whole series of key intelligence and cyber jobs, including being a senior advisor to Prime Minister David Cameron on some of these issues. Ma'am, very much enjoyed your comments in one of the early panels of the forum here. Talk to us a little bit about the dynamic situation we're in. If we look at it, there are comparisons of this age with whether it's 1848 or 1989, where there was revolution sweeping the world. There are similar trends that are going on now, but different. How do you, as you apply a strategic and historical lens to where we are, what period does it match? And most importantly, how do policymakers need to think about this age and how to address it?
Well, they always say that you should learn from history, but history never repeats itself. I would say that...
But it does rhyme, I think, as Winston Churchill would have said.
It does rhyme. If you ask me which one would I most liken it to, I think I would liken the world we're in now to the one that actually heralded the beginning of the 20th century, when old patterns broke up. The world was unable to handle them, and we had a conflagration of major order with the biggest loss of life, actually, that any world conflict has ever seen. We must avoid that. But we are facing a number of challenges. I mean, not only do I think that the democracies themselves are not functioning as well as they might. That's one challenge to us, and we have a lot of internal disturbance. Also linked to the technological revolution that we also face, which is changing the pattern of communication, the way we behave, our notions of security, and indeed the huge possibilities the technological change offers by way of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and also all the biosciences. So there's huge positive in all of this, but it demands management. And the other thing I would say, of course, is that we do face now a challenge to our system, which is even greater than the one that the Russians gave us, I think, during the Cold War, which is China. Why is it more complicated? Because we're integrated with China economically. And this is an economic and political challenge. We could make it a military challenge if we handle it very badly. We should try and avoid that. So these are all the things that we have to cope with, and we have to cope with them simultaneously. Sadly, we can't take them one by one.
What is, you and I were talking before the interview, and one of the questions was, what's the window of action before things potentially go badly? What is the window, and what are sort of step one, step two, step three to sort of get everybody, at least on the Western side of the equation or on the democracy side of the equation, on the right side?
Well, I think, We've known that there's a challenge from China, and I want to focus on that for a moment, for I suppose the last decade at least. What we have got wrong, in my view, is that we haven't talked to each other about it. Countries are doing their own thing separately, and actually sometimes crossing each other's interests, so that we're in disarray. And the longer we go on not actually talking to each other about this huge challenge to us, the more difficult it will become actually to have a common front. And I think we've now reached the point where a common front is both urgent and essential. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks containment is a good idea, or that we could win on that basis because of the degree of integration that's already taken place. Apart from which, much more sensible approach is one where, drawing on our experience in the Cold War, we had the so-called twin track, We laid out the terms of what we were not prepared to tolerate and where we would actually take action. And then we had the offer, of cooperation. And we need to do the same, broadly speaking, different issues, broadly speaking, with China. So we need a positive side. We need to make it quite clear about our view of human rights. And we need to be really, I think, precise about those aspects of our economic and our technological assets that we need to protect. Don't try to protect everything, you can't. But you need really to focus on those things that are really important and get agreement across the Western democracies, in my view, and I use the Western not as a geographical term, but those countries that share democratic process, and try and get a common position on these issues.
Do you think that there is a danger? Deterrence only works if your adversary is convinced that you will use force, and there is a concern by some that the United States, for example, may not be willing to risk some of its high-end assets. Just like we were aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth, the new flagship of the Royal Navy, largest warship Britain has ever made, extraordinary capability. But then there's a question, well, Britain only has 2 of these ships. Is it willing to risk it and the 1,500 sailors that are aboard it in a shooting war? What is the key part, as somebody with your diplomatic experience and security experience, what are the key parts there to make absolutely sure the Chinese don't miscalculate on this? Because if I was China and sitting where I am and have the kind of capability I'm developing, particularly in my backyard, I may start feeling like I have the upper hand on everybody.
I think China doesn't yet feel, that she has a degree of superiority in military capability, that she would take big risks. But it's very clear that she's trying to make the South China Sea a Chinese sea. One looks at what she's doing in the first ring of islands and the second ring of islands, and she's actually building a military capability there and trying to the tactics of denial. We mustn't let that happen. So the first issue is the freedom of the seas and the freedom of passage of goods, those things, and that needs to be an allied task, not left to the United States. I think if we had agreement on some of the other things I've just been mentioning, actually a common effort in relation to China militarily would also become easier, because people are incentivized by the notion of what they're really trying to defend. The other thing is, of course, you rightly mention, is, well, what about deterrence? I haven't mentioned the word deterrence, but deterrence is extremely important. And the enemy or the adversary has to believe that you would retaliate if they take action. You can certainly have it on the basis of no first strike, which I would want. But nevertheless, they have to believe that you would take action if they do something which is aggressive, hostile, and damaging. I would ask the question, therefore, if you make belligerent noises and then you don't follow through, what lesson do people draw? They can get away with it. And actually, we've seen that happen. We've seen that happen over chemical weapons in Syria. We've seen it happen recently in the Gulf. Those are not good precedents. You have to be serious. Don't make belligerent noises if you're not prepared actually to follow through with action if you're challenged on the basis of them. That's an old lesson, and we need to act on that basis. But we need, again, it's another area where we need much greater focus and much greater discussion between those who are potentially participants, actually to get an agreed strategy.
Do you, well, for example, on island building, right? When China started to, the question is, how do you govern a nation that is, or nations that are living outside the norm, using hybrid means, continuously getting, thinking up things that we have trouble addressing? Nobody in Washington knew exactly, or I think even in the international community, exactly how to address China's island building campaign. There was a little bit of cross-justification. Well, I mean, the Filipinos have grounded a ship on a contested reef. Vietnamese are doing some of this stuff on a sort of a lesser basis. And so that gave opportunity for China to do something which at the time people said, I mean, nobody's going to build gigantic islands over these and militarize them. And alas, that's exactly what they managed to do. How do you deter and shape great powers that always find, I mean, it's sort of like a plot out of a James Bond movie, right? I mean, that somebody's going to build islands in the middle of contested waters, and people think, well, that's nuts, any more than, well, Vladimir Putin wouldn't invade Ukraine and take a portion of the country. How do you manage to think creatively enough to deter countries from doing stuff that then becomes an international sticking point in the international order, doesn't even know how to deal with it?
I mean, one of the key bits of your question is don't let it go too far. And we already have a situation. Maintaining and challenging the attempt to close off international waterways has to be challenged. It's very important that we continue to send those ships through those straits. That's the first thing. Second thing is, of course, you have to build the political context. We need to be, I would say, the Western democracies need to be very clear that countries like Japan and Korea are very important to us. We need to have close relations with them. We need to build their military capability. We need to persuade the ASEAN countries that the offer, quotes unquotes, that the Chinese are making at the moment, that somehow they'll have a relationship with China in which they pledge themselves not to conduct military exercises with third countries, quotes, which means the US and others, in this area of the South China Sea, that is an extremely bad policy. They shouldn't follow it. They should reject it. So that you build a political context in Asia where China knows there are limits to the acceptability of her actions of this kind. And she'll go on trying it on until such time as there is a political penalty or a trade penalty or a sanctions penalty to pay. What we don't want to do, it seems to me, however, is simply to try to cut her out of the system. That I don't think is sensible. So we always want to have, this is how we can cooperate. These are the terms on which we can do things, so that we've got the alternative offer.
Do you think that some of the American administration's policies to whether start trade wars with allies or otherwise sort of try to pressure them is a tactic that may actually strategically backfire on the United States, especially at a time, I mean, for example, the administration has wanted to sanction its allies, including the United Kingdom, for using Huawei equipment. And at the end of the day, many of our closest allies have said, we're going to continue buying Huawei equipment, for example. What's the right way, do you think, from going about this?
Issue here. I mean, I'm not happy about American tactics, in the sense that I think it's extremely foolish to quarrel in public with your allies and to threaten them when there has been a certain amount of threat going on. What does that do? It gives the Chinese a platform to intervene, and they've done exactly that in the UK debate. I do accept there's an issue here. But it needs to be discussed, behind closed doors. It needs to be resolved in a way, and it may well involve a bit of compromise. I don't think the UK necessarily can hold on to the position it's taken so far, but I would actually want to see the US be very clear about what it means when it says that there should be no use of Huawei equipment in a country which already has used Huawei equipment, and where the alternatives are not as advanced and much more expensive. So there's a lot here. We need to get this one right, because in many respects, how we handle this particular issue will lay a pattern for how we agree on other technological challenges that we face, and identifying those things that really matter.
Do you think an answer is to build sort of Western technological coalitions where, for example, the Swedes bring their best technology, French bring their best technology, Brits, Germans, US, and you try to develop sort of global products?
I'd love to see that. I do, in fact, think that given that not all the allies have a stake in this, but not all the allies have assets to bring to it and capabilities to bring to it, which are equal. If you actually want to put people on the same technological footing, there is a very strong argument for sharing technological know-how and actually making capabilities available to others. I don't, in fact, think, I have to say, that at the moment the American policy is well adapted to the notion of how you treat friendly countries. I can well see you want to keep others out. But closing off the American market and some of the ways in which the CFIUS regime is in force doesn't seem to me to be very intelligent. So I would want to see, actually, and this is where the technologies need to come in, and where none of this strategy that I'm setting out, could conceivably be done without the involvement of the private sector. And I think the private sector will be a force, actually, for international cooperation between the allies, rather than trying to make the nation state the barrier, at all times.
Or try to use, for example, sanction and other tools to drive sales of your product over other, which unfortunately some of our allies feel there's a big piece of that ongoing. And then artificial intelligence, quantum computing, I mean, there are a number of fields this is applicable to. Your time is short, so let me ask you two last quick questions. One's on cyber. You are a leading global cyber thinker. Northrop Grumman sponsors our cyber coverage and our weekly cyber report on key cyber issues. What's the right way to regain the advantage here? Because for too long, Western democracies have been exceptionally open. There has not nearly been the kind of focus on cybersecurity that they should be. If you look at senior military people, they understand their combat disciplines, but actually don't understand cyber nearly as well as they should. What's the right, and if you look at it from a K through 12 standpoint, kids who are digital natives are not being raised with some fundamentally basic cyber hygiene tools, even vaguely. How do you think about this space? How do you think about this as a domain of warfare? And that's not even getting to the disinformation piece, which I want to follow up with you on as well.
Well, there's both the civilian and there's the military, and of course the technology is the same. And you've got to do lots of things simultaneously, and it starts, as you rightly said, with the kids. It's the cyber education, it's the hygiene, it's the skills basis, it's getting women, girls into the techie subjects, the STEM subjects. So you need to transform. You need to do quite a lot about your education system. Really important as a foundation. Secondly, you need to then carry that through into civilian behavior, into personal use, but above all, obviously, into how a corporate operates and how government operates. And you have to have, pretty strict rules about layered security, about access, and about behavior online. We're still too lax about all of that. People really do have to accept that this is not a free domain, that there are rules that they do have to conform to. Otherwise, we will go on being extremely vulnerable. And this is both criminal and, of course, it's state activity. And they are constantly devising new challenges, new ways of penetrating our system, new ways of cheating us, new ways of stealing, but new ways also of disrupting. And I think increasingly, the theft remains very important, particularly theft of intellectual property, but also money. But we need also to look at our ability to both prevent disruption, some of the big ones that we've seen, and one day there will be an even bigger attempt, I've no doubt about that. And secondly, our resilience, actually, when it does happen. And that is still neglected, how you recover. And recovery, and the insurance companies, I think the insurance industry has a big part to play in helping, actually, companies think about recovery systems. So it's a public and private system. Then there's the military. And the military have to assure their systems. We need to have, watertight, separate systems for military communications. I don't think it can be part of the general system. And the military, you rightly say, Joint Command, really good idea, but everybody in those commands and in the 3 armed services or the 4 armed services needs to have the basic understanding, so that they are not left relying on someone else to understand the nature of the environment that they actually face, which is changed.
Do you think that that there's in terms of cyber deterrence or cyber offense, what are the right ways to think about this? Because there are those who say, in an atmosphere like this, you have to conduct many more cyber offensive operations to give stubs in the nose to the guys who are doing stuff to you, to give them pause. There are others who say, well, look, that starts to get on an escalatory ladder that's potentially very dangerous. And in fact, there are people who are very uneasy about the freedom and the openness with which the American president has discussed offensive cyber capabilities. What's the best way to deter, or do standard, normal deterrent posture language work in cyberspace as well as they do in what might be a kinetic or diplomatic realm?
I think your adversaries need to understand that you have capabilities and that you would use them. I think as things stand at the moment, I think you need to set out the general circumstances in which you would consider an action of certain kind to be unacceptable and which would be the object then of retaliation. They need to know where the limits lie. So that's one thing you need to do. And secondly, you really do need to have those capabilities. I don't think this is an area where you can fake. Because to some extent your adversary will test your systems and they will have some good idea of actually how good you are. So I think this is a real issue. I am not in favour of people other than governments engaging in that kind of activity. I'm very much in favour of governments having serious retaliatory capabilities in this area, so the others know that if they start disrupting our system, they will get it in kind. That's very important, and that is part of modern deterrence.
And I would like to think that anybody would think twice before tangling with GCHQ at the end of the day. Exactly. Just truly incredible capability there, but as well in the National Security Agency. Last question, information and disinformation. we are in sort of an unprecedented age. Sacha Baron Cohen, the actor, gave a brilliant speech to the Anti-Defamation League's annual conference where he called out major tech companies for actually enabling the kind of propaganda that makes hate speech much, much more possible and disinformation much more possible because, as he put it, I think rightly, some crackpot lunatics thing can look as truthful as something, for example, the BBC did, and I'm saying that because you used to be a governor of the BBC. You know, how do we need to think about this space? What are applicable Cold War lessons from it? Because in your address you did talk a little bit about the issue. What's the way for governments and individual people to think about this space? Because you're finding actually bad public decision making in part because they have been tampered with, whether it's during national elections, whether it's been Brexit, obviously an ongoing debate because the Prime Minister hasn't released the report that suggests that there was significantly more Russian involvement in the Brexit vote than... and money was also, alas, in Italy, it was millions of dollars of money that went into the former government. So, you know, what's the way to think about this space at a critical time when governments are wrestling with fundamental issues of free speech, which I think are legitimate, but also then illegitimate speech?
Well, you put your finger on something that's really difficult. I think that
I would not try to ask you a simple question.
Awareness is one thing, actually. I mean, people need to be much more aware of the possibility that something they're watching actually could be a fake, and less credulity. So that's partly a matter of sort of understanding. And I think that's growing, actually. I think people are now aware of the fact that the stuff could be fake. Secondly, of course, you can apply technology to it. We do know now how actually to disaggregate an apparently true episode, which in fact never took place. You can do that technologically and demonstrate that it is fake. We need to do a lot more of that. Use of that kind of technology should be used actually to demonstrate where there is a clear case of it, so people to understand that this is not. They're not being told a fib when they say this one is really fake, and I'll show you how. So that's another thing I think that we can and should do. But thirdly, of course, governments themselves have to do two things. First, they must tell the truth. Do governments always tell the truth? I think not. And in election campaigns, you know, there is a proneness to exaggeration and indeed to flipping over into things which are essentially untrue. So it should exercise a discipline on political systems, you know, to honor the values that they say they stand for.
And what are lessons from the Cold War that are applicable today? Because Russia and its partners were constantly trying to disinform, whether it was the British or the European public or the U.S. public.
Yeah, well, you rightly put your finger on something else, which is, of course, there was propaganda and there was counter-propaganda. We did put forward our own story. We do much less of that now. And indeed, there were whole departments of governments, including my own, which were devoted to actually making the case for democracy, putting forward, you know, the virtues, the issues, the rights you had, all of those things. We need to start doing that again. We have to defend and promote our system at the same time.
Baroness Neville-Jones, member of the House of Lords. Ma'am, absolute honor and pleasure to talk to you, and look forward to talking again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was very delight to talk to you.